Thank you for downloading this podcast from the British Theatre Guide. For more information about British Theatre Guide, please visit britishtheatreguide.info.
Ben Brantley has long been the doyen of New York theatre critics, writing for the New York Times. That is the role that is supposed to be able to close a show within about one paragraph, I think, but also make successes, and he's enjoyed himself doing that, I'm sure. To British readers, maybe he's the equivalent to Michael Billington, except that he hasn't actually retired yet, as far as I'm aware, unless I'm missing something. He's in London for a relatively short stay to see some top shows, including Leopoldstadt and The Visit, which we might discuss. Ben, welcome.
Thank you very much.
First of all, I always get asked it, so I'll ask you, how did you end up becoming a theatre critic? Were you a theatre person as a child?
I was obsessed with theatre as a child. I was totally devoted to it. I grew up on the periphery of a Southern University called Wake Forest in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. It had a fabulous theatre program. So I was taken to live theatre and fairly adult shows from the time I was, certainly as early as my first reading days. I appeared in local theatre, did local commercials, that sort of thing. I loved the perfume of grease paint and sweat backstage and chalk and all of that. And as I grew, I come from a family of journalists. As I grew older, journalism, writing seemed the path of least resistance. I was also a much better writer than I ever was an actor, though I admire actors tremendously for their willingness to get naked. And by that I mean not literally as much as just to expose what's inside. I'm a much more guarded person. So being at a keyboard is a much happier place for me to be, always has been. I went to Swarthmore College, sort of intense graduate preparatory university, but really wanted to get out. I really wanted to get to New York. That was always sort of my Oz from very early childhood, partly because theater was there. And the first interview I had after college, where I wound up working, was with a place called Women's Wear Daily, which was then the reigning fashion bible of the garment trade. And the publisher asked me if I could have any job in the world, what would it be? And I said, theater critic of the New York Times. And we both sort of laughed because that seemed like a fair distance from what I was applying for. But in any case, I got the job there. It was the best graduate school I could have gone to. I got to travel a lot. I got to interview all sorts of people. I was made the chief fashion critic, if you can imagine, with no background whatsoever in fashion, which was also terrific training, because it forced you to look with great concentration at this evanescent thing on the runway, a woman usually walking in high heels for maybe 30 seconds, if that. And you had to remember the detail of it. And it also, and you had to pick up a very specific vocabulary, and you passed judgment that meant something. So to do that in your early 20s was actually great, almost military training for what I'm doing now. I worked first in New York for them, then in Paris as the bureau chief. Went from there to work for Tina Brown, the illustrious editor, first at Vanity Fair and then The New Yorker. It's a circuitous route, as you can tell. At that time, the one thing I was allowed to do outside of my Condé Nast contract was to do movie reviews for Elle magazine. My first editor there was a woman named Alex Witchell, who wound up marrying Frank Rich, who was then the theater critic of the New York Times. And at a certain point, they were looking for a new second-string theater critic and asked if they could throw my name into the hat. And I went, yeah, sure. And then it happened almost instantly. And that was 27 years ago.
Right, and you took over from Frank Rich relatively quickly?
No, I was the second string theater critic. Yeah, I guess it was relatively quickly. There were a couple of interim critics. The first person to succeed Frank was a man named David Richards, who'd been at the Washington Post and had been doing the Sunday reviews at the Times. He didn't last very long in that job. And then Vincent Canby, who'd been the chief film critic, what became sort of an interim chief theater critic while I was toughened up. And I became the chief theater critic in 1996, which is a title I now share with Jesse Green, who is a great friend of mine, who came from New York Magazine.
And at that point, you suddenly literally did become the man who could close a show overnight if you chose to.
No, I don't.
At least in principle.
Yeah, in theory. I think that's more mythological than anything else. Even Frank, who was known as the Butcher of Broadway, didn't like cats. I mean, which ran forever and ever, as we know, and has been consistently reincarnated since then. And even if you look back to like the 1920s when A.B.'s Irish Rose opened on Broadway, the critics hated it, and it broke records. I think shows have always been able to go under that sort of critical radar. When it counts, I think, is when it's a small, non-musical show without a brand name that sort of needs nurturing or attention called to it. And those are usually the things that are most fun to write about, too.
What about the actual process? So you've been lead critic for the best part of 25 years. Do you ever think, why am I doing this? Do you wake up every morning and think this is the most wonderful thing, I can't believe I'm doing it? Or where are you on that scale?
No, it's much more the latter. I enjoyed my earlier jobs, but they never felt entirely like comfortable fits. Fashion obviously wasn't something that I was innately interested in. And celebrity journalism, which was essentially what I was doing for Tina Brown, I find a little demoralizing to execute. I don't really like asking people about their love lives. So when I got this, it was like I can actually be paid for doing what I'm passionate about. And I haven't stopped feeling that way. I can honestly say I'm never bored at the theater if I'm there in a professional capacity, because you have to pay attention. And if you have to pay attention, if you have to focus even on why you would be bored if you weren't there as a critic, it's of interest. It puts your mind in high gear.
And what about the writing? Because your reviews are still something that we just don't see in this country anymore. I don't know how many words you get, but is it 1,000 or 1,500?
It's about 1,000 words, sometimes a little more than that.
And quite often here, journalists are restricted to 300, 400 if they're lucky.
Yeah,
so it's a big difference.
I mean, the Times is wonderful in that regard. It's true for the film critics, for the classical music critics, for the pop critics, for the television critics. We are just given that real estate, and it's a luxury that few other people have outside of a magazine like The New Yorker. So, when I was at Elle, I was writing in miniature, really. Those were very short film reviews. They were like 300, 400 words, and that was sort of like doing haiku. I found it more difficult in a way, because you had to keep chiseling away. At this point, my writing muscles are conditioned to stretch to fill 1,000 words. It's like I almost can feel myself shutting down as I near that word count. I think it had to be shorter. I think that's an art form in itself, writing shorter. I think in some ways it's a more difficult form. But for the moment, I'm very grateful to have the latitude I have.
And how many shows do you typically review a week, say?
It varies. In high season, it can be as many as 4. It used to be when I'd come here. Now they're sending me over more specifically for openings for short trips, so they will come out at the same time that the London reviews do. But in the past, I would come over for as long as 3 weeks at a time and do notebooks. And in those days, I would see as many as 10 shows a week here, which you have the luxury of doing because of the way matinees are staggered.
What about the comparison between British theatre and American theatre? There was a kind of... Well, I had a theory, I think there's a general theory, not too long ago, that all straight plays started in London and ended up on Broadway, and all musicals started on Broadway and ended up in London. I'm sure that was never quite the truth, but there were times when it looked very much like that.
It did.
I'd chuck in Dublin as well, actually.
Right. I did a dialogue with Michael Billington a couple of years ago, in which he was saying he had always thought that was the case, but that now it seemed to be the reverse. And it also used to always be thought of that England was the big picture place, whereas American plays tended to be more intimate domestic dramas. And he said he didn't think that was so much the case anymore. I think since Angels in America, that's been true, that there's been a breadth of ambition and scope that Tony Kushner raised the bar for. There is so much transatlantic traffic now, so many plays that originate here and vice versa. It's not as hard and fast a distinction. I've often been wrong about plays I thought that might not translate to New York that I loved here. For example, History Boys seemed to me to be a very particular British taste, and of course it became a huge hit in America. And One Man, Two Governors, which is a very specific kind of comedy, rooted in music hall, really. And Americans loved it, and it turned...
Against which Enron, which looked like it ought to be... desirable for a New York audience, none of them saw it to find out if they liked it or not in New York. It only ran for a few weeks, didn't it?
Oh, Enron?
Yes.
No, I didn't like that very much.
Right.
That it seemed excessively didactic to me. It was sort of loud agitprop theater, and I do think there's a kind of American bashing theater that probably plays better over here than for those of us who are used to either doing that kind of bashing ourselves every day or reading about it in the newspapers. But no, Enron died rather quickly and infamously in New York. Although I'm quite admiring of the playwright and what she's done subsequently.
Indeed. What about musicals?
Musicals, it's true. It used to be the hard and fast... Well, that's not true. I was starting to say it used to be the hard and fast rule that the musical comedy was really an American genre. But don't forget, there was that period in the, I guess starting in the late 70s, early 80s, when the king of musicals everywhere in the world was Andrew Lloyd Webber. Or Budlil Schönberg. It was the it was the time of the European operetta, and American musicals in those days couldn't really get arrested in comparison. More recently, I think there's been an interesting resurgence in musicals. I mean, Hamilton was a hit like no other, and that obviously is done well here. A show like Rent, which was sort of the most obvious ancestor or immediate ancestor of Hamilton, I don't think did do as well when it came here. I think it's
probably not.
Yeah,
but then you've got things like Come From Away, Dear Evan Hansen, both of which have made a big splash on this side of the Atlantic.
Done quite well. I do think the world is becoming a more homogenous place, or at least the English-speaking world, and of course English is the lingua franca of so many countries now. I think it's healthy. It's great that that shows have all this room to grow and to travel. I do miss the particularity of individual cultures. I think there's kind of a smoothing out. One thing I have noticed is how much better, we were talking about this earlier, but how much better generally young, in particular, British performers are at doing American accents. Australians especially are brilliant generally at finding the tongues of different regions that speak the English language. So there's a certain blurring of distinctions that I guess on some level is healthy. But one of the things I used to love in coming to England, which I've been doing for several decades now, was seeing a world that I didn't see in New York. Now, of course, there's so many... I mean, you walk down the streets and you can see a dozen shops that you could find in New York City as well. And often the fare on stage is the same kind of binational collaboration.
It seems to me from a recent visit to New York, and I won't remember everything that I saw, that there's a really strong group of American playwrights writing exciting theatre. So I saw Stephen Adly Gurgis' new play, Adam Rapp, Lucas Nath, if I pronounced that correctly.
Right.
And several others, a couple of really good shows from Lincoln Center. It just feels... Whereas, as I say, maybe 10 years ago, I don't think I could have named it. I could have spent a couple of weeks in New York and not found that many good plays, and I probably missed half the strong stuff that I saw. Yeah.
I mean, there was a great golden age of American playwrights. I think probably the theatre was much stronger in, say, the late 40s, early 50s in New York than it was in London until you got to The Angry Young Men. Yeah. But you have Tennessee Williams, Arthur Miller, Eugene O'Neill. Yeah. And more recently, and I think it's had something to do with the final, long-delayed opening of doors to playwrights of different ethnic backgrounds, different colors, etc. The strongest, I think most exciting plays often now are from African-American playwrights.
I should have mentioned Jeremy O. Harris, shouldn't I?
Oh, yeah, that was Extraordinary Slave Play, which was, you couldn't have imagined that it being on Broadway even 5 years ago, but this was such a raw and ultimately rather despairing look at interracial sexual relationships and the legacy of slavery in how black and white people have to look at each other, whether they acknowledge it or not. But Jackie Sibley's Drury, did you see Fairview?
Yes, I did, yeah.
I mean, that was... When theater can shock you like that, when it's not just shocking for shock's sake, but when it can kick you in the stomach and you think, oh my gosh, and suddenly you're seeing the world through a new set of eyes. I thought she really did that.
Yes.
Susan Laurie Parks, I think, is a brilliant playwright. And it's been... All that's been very exciting. There have also been a number of young although young becomes not so young so quickly now, but youngish, again, female playwrights often. Claire Barron, I don't know if you saw Dance Nation when it came here.
Yes, I did, yeah.
Anne Washburn with Mr. Burns and Shipwreck. I mean, those are some of the most engaged, politically engaged, inventive theater, where it's not, and this is true, I think, of someone like Drury, too, where it's not just the content, it's the form that's being used to explore the content.
It's also interesting what doesn't come across. So Annie Baker, everything she does now seems to make it to London sooner or later.
Yeah.
Stephen Adly Burgess probably will do. Whereas, say, Tracy Letts, who has a new play opening, you'd think he would, but there's no guarantee.
Well, August Osage County did.
August Osage County did wonderfully, but a lot of his other plays either have taken a long time or only appeared in small theatres, which surprises me.
Right. He's not, I mean, he may have the disadvantage in being a more seemingly middle-of-the-road playwright. Yeah. He wasn't always. The early stuff, like Bug,
oh, absolutely,
and Killer Joe, which was revived here not too long ago at Trafalgar Studios, yes. Killer Joe.
And in fact, Bug had a revival within the last 5 years on a small scale, yeah.
I love Bug. Yeah. I mean, and that's truly shocking theatre. I remember when I saw those two plays the first time in the 1990s, it was, again, wow, is he really doing this? Is he really going to go there? August Osage County seemed to me much more in a mainstream tradition than anything he'd done previously. But he's a fascinating playwright and remains in a more soft-spoken way a provocateur, I think.
Yeah. What about the visit this time to London? So I know that you saw Leopoldstadt. Now, I'm dying to know what you thought about. This is Tom Stoppard's latest effort.
Right. We were able to run those on, to compete with the reviews breaking here. Leopoldstadt, I was very moved by. I mean, how can you not be? It was it's very touching as a sort of personal declaration. It's, as many people have said, it's in some ways his most personal play, a sort of self-examination of his own conscience as a Jew who didn't really know, or at least acknowledge he was Jewish for so long. It is, I think, his most conventional play by far. And I like the meta-theatrics of Tom Stoppard. I like the cerebral gamesmanship and so forth. And I don't think that is necessarily exclusive of deep emotional content. I think even a play like Jumpers, which seems to be entirely cerebral, is actually all about heartbreak. And Coast of Utopia, which I loved, the same thing. This is a more... It's as if, and I did write this, it's as if he felt that what he had to say in this case, which is really asking audiences never, ever to forget, and nor should we, what happened during the Holocaust, what happened to an entire race. But it was as if the subject was so important, and he were taking it so personally for the first time, that he couldn't do the kind of theatrical tricks he usually plays. It was much, much more straightforward. But I thought it was very well acted. It was a huge cast of characters, and not all of them had a chance to make an indelible impression. I thought Adrian Scarborough in particular, though. Yeah,
no, he was very special.
Was exceptional.
It also amazes me, and maybe it shouldn't, that a playwright of 82 now can write something as sweeping as that and pull it all together. You would have thought the memory might be diminishing slightly, and if it is, it's not apparent.
No. Of course, he's always written about memory to some extent, hasn't he? And the falsity of memory. And one of the things that interested me about this play is that memory, for example, in Arcadia is a very capricious phenomenon. It's very fluid. We may not know exactly what happened. I mean, Stoppard is so often about... Even though he's one of the most cerebral of playwrights and has sort of the steel-trap mind, he often writes about what we can't know, what we can't possibly grasp, how inadequate words often are. In this, he's using memory in a very different way. He's saying, this actually happened, look back. Memory's not a prism, as I wrote in this case, it's a laser.
I think you've also seen The Visit, which is... I was going to say Tony Kushner's new play. That's slightly misleading. It's Friedrich Dürrenmatt's old play, adapted by Tony Kushner and directed by Jeremy Herrin, so it's Anglo-American. Right,
it is an Anglo... And it was initially to have been done, I think it was written with Oprah Winfrey in mind.
Really?
Oh, yes. Okay. Which would have been extraordinary. Can you imagine? Because it's not that she's essentially that character. I don't think she has that kind of venom or lust for revenge, but she is... effectively.
So to tell listeners, that would be Oprah Winfrey being replaced by Leslie Manville, which is very, very hard to conceive.
Yeah, it is. It would have been a very different play. I sort of wish that this particular version of The Visit had been done in the States initially. I think there was a certain culture gap that that this production fell into. I was aware of... I don't know if that was true the night you saw it, but actors didn't seem entirely confident, the supporting cast in any case, in their lines, playing members of a dying factory town in upstate New York, the town of Slurry. I also thought it was way too long for its purposes, and
it's cut to 3.5 hours. I think it did start off even longer than that.
It started off apparently more than 4 hours.
Well, one thing I'd say about the actors and the lines was my perception was more that the microphone system wasn't as invisible as it was supposed to be, so I was hearing voices coming from strange places, not necessarily picking up words.
Yeah, which we should be past by now.
Absolutely, yeah.
That amazes me.
And I know that space is difficult, but they've had 20 years of miking it to learn, and it didn't feel quite there, which may have been part of the problem as well. Yeah,
we've yet to master the technology. When I started in the job, in musicals in particular, the miking drove me crazy, because you really didn't know where voices were coming from.
Dare I say it, my recent trip to Broadway, which was earlier this year, I was having exactly the same problem still. Once or twice.
Yeah, it does happen occasionally. What I will say in praise of The Visit is I think Leslie Manville is absolutely splendid. Yeah. She plays a woman of incredible focus, to put it mildly, who's determined to get a bit of her own back after youthful humiliations, and does so in the most savage, grotesque means possible, while seeming not like the most civilized person in the world, because she's jaded. She's as old as time itself, and she's largely made of prosthetic devices now, isn't she? She's a survivor of many accidents and has fake legs, fake arms. She even takes off her hand at one point. But I've admired Leslie Manville a lot for so long, and she showed some of that quality, that sort of steeliness, I thought, in the film she did with Daniel Day-Lewis, Phantom Thread, as the sort of guardian, watchdog sister of a great couturier in that. But also there were traces of it, I thought, in her Mrs. Alving in Ibsen's Ghost, which was probably the best Mrs. Alving I've ever seen. I thought that was a stupendous performance. And in this, she's finally given the stage star turn that she absolutely deserves. And she seems to be having the time of her life. But there's something ultimately, for a character who is described as monstrous, mythic, etc., you're also always aware of what she talks about, the young woman who is still on some level in love. And what a terrible force love can become if it's allowed to gestate and fester as it has with her. I thought it was a beautiful performance. And she looks great in those couture-style clothes, doesn't she?
Even without the legs.
Even without the legs, even when she takes her legs off and her hand off.
Probably finally, just one of the differences is that you get far more words than we ever do, which is wonderful. Right. The other difference between New York and London, I've never understood it because it feels like it's in the wrong direction, is that for the most part in London, critics are obliged to append stars to their reviews. And in New York, it just doesn't seem to happen.
It does with other publications.
Certainly, New York Times has resisted
the
it.
New York Times is, I think, one of the last holdouts. The magazines don't either. The New Yorker certainly doesn't. I don't think... Well, there aren't so many magazines anymore, are they? No. Certainly not magazines doing theatre reviews. But at the Post, when it runs theatre reviews, still has stars, or does have stars. It's been discussed, I think, the possibility of it. What we do have is something called a critic's pick, which has some little special, custom-tooled insignia attached to it, and it's like a good housekeeping seal of approval, as it were. And I don't even love doing that. I mean, ideally, you'd like people to read a review, and whether it's an unconditional rave or not, to be able to see through the writer's personality to discern whether they would like it themselves or not. But I do find often that people, and even with myself, if I'm in a hurry and I'm flipping through a newspaper, I'll go, only 2 stars, I don't want to see that. And that's not really fair to the play. No matter what the power of a critic, ideally, the reader should sit down, read what that person has to say, and then decide for themselves. I
subscribe entirely to that viewpoint, but I'm becoming a very small minority in this country nowadays. Any other thoughts about either theatre in London or New York?
No, I don't think so. I mean, what you do have is although I know it's in jeopardy, is bigger subsidized theater, and especially you have the glory that is the National Theater, where you can invest. I mean, I thought The Visit was seriously overproduced. I thought that it was a case, it actually made the play's most convincing case for conspicuous consumption. Because
they certainly made full use of all of the machinery of the Olivier stage.
The machinery and the huge cast, and I thought too much almost. It was hard to keep all the parts moving. Even the film noir jazz that they used, I thought wasn't entirely appropriate. And I thought, actually, one of the first productions of The Visit I ever saw many years ago before I was in this job, which was Complicities, or Complicités version, where did you see that?
I didn't know.
Catherine Hunter.
Okay.
A very young Catherine Hunter played Claire. And she won the Olivier Award for it that year, I think. It must have been the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s. And it was minimal scenery. It was Complicity doing story theater as they did it in those days. And that made much more of an impression on me, ultimately, than this did.
Actually, a real final question. Any other American playwrights that you would tip that British audiences should be looking out for? So Jeremy O. Harris, I think, has a play coming on at the Almeida sometime in the spring.
Yeah.
I think so. Any other playwrights that we may not know about who you'd hotly tip?
Alicia Harris, who is another African-American playwright, wrote a sort of extraordinary variation on the Sergio Leone revenge western, except set in urban culture, called Is God Is, that I think is being made into a film. I think Scott Rudin may have the rights to it. That, I think, is... she's certainly worth watching for. She also wrote something called What to Send Out When It Goes Down, which is basically a work of catharsis for black audiences who feel perpetually thwarted and dismissed by white people. And of course, as a white critic, I went to it and felt incredibly self-conscious, but also thrilled, as one always does when there's a voice of that kind of potency. One thing about Broadway, and I wonder if this is true of the West End, is how much it's open to more experimental theater technique. I think a lot of it has to do with the producer Scott Rudin's endorsement of Ivo Van Hove, and I know that his View from the Bridge, which I thought was absolutely brilliant, Arthur Miller's View from the Bridge, originated here, and then went on to the Young Vic, and then went on to the West End. But his production of The Crucible, I thought, was extraordinary.
That hasn't got here yet. I'm sure it will.
No, it starred Ben Whishaw.
Oh, right.
Yeah, and who was not an obvious choice for the part of the strapping. I mean, I think of Liam Neeson or Daniel Day-Lewis, but there was something very touching about the particular sensitivity of Ben Whishaw. Of course, he did do All About Eve here at Van Hove, didn't he? In the West End, which I thought was pretty bad, to tell the truth. But no. So I suppose it's. I do find that there's more openness to innovation in theater, in mainstream theater. I'm talking about expensive theater on both sides of the Atlantic, and that I find incredibly encouraging.
I think here certainly places like the Royal Court are very strong on experimental theatre.
That's always been true.
And it's always been true,
right.
But maybe even more so. I think
right.
Vicky Featherston is really taking a lot of risks at the moment,
right.
and she was progenitor of the best new playwright, I think,
right.
Critic Circle, that was announced last week.
Right.
When it goes wrong, it can be really tedious to sit through. When it's right, it's thrilling. It's enthralling.
Thrilling like nothing else. I think that's very true.
But probably less so here on the main stages.
Yeah.
Maybe the National will do it a bit. But the West End has become...
the Almeida to some extent.
Yeah, the West End has kind of become very conservative. Really, they just want simple comedies. They want old plays coming back that they know are safe, or they want musicals.
Right, and it's
Broadway was like that. Maybe slightly less so now.
I think it may be a little less so now. I mean, overall, I think because Broadway is such an expensive proposition, producers often want insurance, and insurance in many cases means the guarantee of a brand name, which is either the name of a star or the name of a familiar title. And that I found a little depressing, that successful movies are continually being adapted for the stage, often as musicals. But sometimes it works.
Ben Brantley, thank you so much.
Thank you.
You've been listening to a podcast from British Theatre Guide. For more information, please visit britishtheatreguide.info.